Have you ever looked at a crane and thought to yourself, wow, that looks like a pretty big gun? Well, this is what went through my head when I was younger, and eventually I turned this idea into a vehicle design for my world building project. So today we're going to look at the design process of this vehicle idea and look at all the history it went through before its final rendition and also maybe learn some things about it. As you may have known, I'm working on a world building project. And in order to complete one of these projects, you need to fill it up with different things. So far, I've only filled it up with a flag design, which isn't very substantial. So to add on, we're going to be looking at a mech design that I made for the Elishian Empire, and eventually turn it into a 3D model to use as an asset in the short film that I'm trying to make. Taking a look at the very first design of this vehicle, we can see the main ideas that would carry on to the future versions. The central idea being of a biped walker with a main armament that is balanced out by a counterweight system at the back, as well as having a house-like roof to complement it, of course. The reason onto why I designed it to be like this is contributed to two main factors. The first was that I wanted to have the aesthetic of turning normal things into weapons, which in this case was a house, combined with some elements of a construction crane, which is indicated by the counterweight system in the back. And well, the second reason being that of the rule of cool, which needs no introduction. Despite the great initial design, I ended up developing my skills as an artist as the years went on, and this resulted in the design of the vehicle to change as well, thus leading to the second design. This new model has more detail to it and has added features as well, such as an extra joint to the leg and a segmented barrel. Not only this, but it also received an addition that would allow its functionality to be more plausible in world. As you can see below the cannon, there appears to be a hole, and this is supposed to be a lens of some sort. This would allow the crew to be able to see the outside world, a design decision that should have been in the first one from the get-go. Another design decision that I want to make a note of here is its newly defined scale. In this illustration, you can see that there's a background sketch included, which allows its size to be understood better. It was also around this time where I came up with a name for this type of vehicle, that being the Witch House. Although this name sounds odd, if you take the time to understand where it came from, it might make more sense. There is an old legend about a witch house that used to walk on two chicken legs. This idea ended up fitting well with the design of the vehicle, considering that this was the inspiration to have a walking house. However, after deciding on a name, the design would end up changing again as my skills improved as well, leading us to the third design rendition of the vehicle. In this version, there's more details added to the overall machinery due to my experience of drawing increasing. And there was also an overall theme of technicality. There were a couple of added features that would allow this witch house to be more practical in a real combat situation. Such additions include a anti-personnel machine gun mount at the bottom of the cannon, as well as adding a crotch box to allow the turret to move independently of the legs, as in the previous designs the legs were directly mounted to the hull of the vehicle. There was also the addition of a entering and exiting hatch on the top of the vehicle, which again should have been included in the first design as it seems to be a very important part of any vehicle. I also want to make a quick note about the interior of the vehicle, as beforehand I had not thought about it because I wasn't really thinking about a story. But more recently, I decided to implement this design into the short film that I'm trying to make, and because there are characters involved, I need to portray what goes on in the inside of the machine. This led to a few sketches and designs of the internal layout. As you can see here, the crew in general seems to be situated around a central gearbox with all the equipment and requirements needed to make this thing run around them. There are a few mechanisms and inventions that I want to elaborate more on because they really allowed this design to be functional within this diesel punk-like story where technology is rather primitive. However, due to how convoluted and technical they are, I'll have to save it for its own video. But besides that, I ended up making a 3D model of the interior and turning that into a 2D illustration to use in the short film. However, moving back to the exterior of the vehicle, I want to take a look at the final design rendition that was made on paper. And as you can see here, I drew this in a very specific way. I ended up drawing the vehicle from different angles that would allow me to see the full dimensions of it if it were in a 3D space. Why, you may ask? Well, because I was going to make it into a 3D model, of course. I knew early on in the production process of this short film that drawing this vehicle from different angles consistently would be repetitive and generally annoying to do, As a result, I decided that having a 3D model of it will allow me to have consistency overall. My initial plan was to simply pose this model in the way that I needed to and then draw over it. However, it occurred to me that there were filters available that would allow this 3D model to look like a drawing. So this is the path that I ended up taking for this model. However, before we jump into the 3D space though, I want to acknowledge that I'm relatively new to 3D modeling. As a result, there are a few things that could have had better execution, as you'll see in a moment. The way I began this modeling process was to simply import the 2D images of my reference into the 3D space. Right here, I constructed different angles of the view that would allow me to form a cube that showed all perspectives of the vehicle. After which, I ended up modeling the vehicle based on this reference by making basic shapes and arranging their vertices to line up with the edges of the vehicle. Repeating the process for every aspect of it led me to have a pretty solid model. After the geometry for the vehicle was done, I moved on to managing its mesh. The reason being is because I needed to unwrap its UV map. This would allow me to add textures to it, in other words, give it color. This was the most tedious part of the process, however, it ended up giving me a pretty good texture to the model. But I do want to make a note of the redundancies that I went through to make this. Because I wasn't experienced in Blender for too long, I didn't know I could reuse textures. What this meant was that I ended up making a Photoshop painting for every single object in the model, and there was a lot of them. But after that was done, I moved on, leading me to the next thing that I did. That being adding an armature to the model that would allow me to position it in the ways that I needed to. After that was added to the model, I was able to do some things with it, as you can see here. But ultimately, it kind of went nowhere though, because I ended up abandoning this model. The reason being is that I thought it had too many shortcomings, as the armature did not work in the way that I wanted to sometimes, and I believe the model could have been more detailed. However, I would not revisit it until recently. But when I did return, I ended up giving it a major glow up. I had learned more about the software as I began to study it more by looking in the internet for advice, and eventually was able to apply those better skills to the model, thus leading us to the final design rendition of the witch house. As you may be able to observe, there are a few additions to the overall design. This is including some attention to details in places that were plain, as well as adding entirely new features to the vehicle. Such features include a flare pod, which is meant to communicate with the airships that it works closely with when radio communication is not available. Behind this pod, there are a set of ammo drums that are meant to feed the armament that is located on the other side of the witch house, that being a rotating pair of heavy machine guns. These were designed with the purpose of taking down enemies that its light machine gun could not take care of, but also too light for its main cannon to take on. These enemies would include things like aircraft and lightly armored walkers. On top of this addition, I added ventilation systems all around the vehicle. These were meant to relieve pressure from the machine, as in this world, these vehicles run on expanding gases, an idea that I may explore further in another video. But besides this and the addition of armor paneling and lighting systems to the vehicle, I also have improved the technicalities of the model. As I mentioned earlier, the reason why I left behind the first model was because it could not articulate in the way that I wanted to. However, when revisiting the model, I fixed these errors by designing better joints, as well as fixing the armature. The final thing that I added to this model was the addition of the grease pencil filter. This will allow me to have my model blended more seamlessly into the rest of the 2D animation that will be in the film. But after that was it. The model was completed, and I began to make animations with it, which I'll show to you now. And while those run in the background, I'll take a brief moment to go over some of the lore of the witch house. If you watched my former video, you'll know about the Elishian Empire and its relation to the air, so it may be a bit confusing onto why they would invest in a land vehicle, but the explanation to this is rather simple. There were some situations in which their mighty airships, although overwhelming, could not help in. Such instances included times where they did not want to risk harming possible interests, these being important infrastructure or the lives of citizens who are still in the area. Harming none of these is a very hard challenge for an airship, as typically these are loaded out with the biggest guns and not the most precise ones. Another reason onto why they invested in land vehicles is because they simply cannot put airships everywhere. Although they have a vast fleet, they need to prioritize certain locations over others. However, they do not want to leave certain areas underarmed. And the last reason onto why they have these now is because they acknowledge that there are some places where they cannot put airships. Whether the reason is a former treaty that was signed, or tough weather conditions, the witch house would provide the means of delivering sufficient force to the places that need it. And well, there you go. A brief history of the witch house and also what I've been working on so far. I want to thank you for watching the video. I truly appreciate it. And I certainly hope you can join me on the future ones. But until next time, I'll see you then.